It all started with a text. My wife, Sarah, had been away on a business trip for 3 days. She'd been texting me updates, sending pictures of her hotel room, and even FaceTimed me once to show off the view. She seemed happy, too happy, maybe, but I brushed it off. She'd always been ambitious, and her job required her to travel occasionally. Still, something felt off. Her laughter during our calls sounded forced, and her texts were unusually brief. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, we'd been married for 7 years. Trust was the foundation of our relationship. Or so I thought. When she returned home, she was all smiles, her suitcase rolling behind her. She hugged me tightly, her perfume lingering in the air. But as I reached for her bag to carry it upstairs, she snatched it away, laughing nervously. "I've got it," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. That's when the first seed of doubt planted itself in my mind. The days leading up to her trip had been normal, or at least, they seemed that way. Sarah had been busy preparing for her presentation, staying late at the office, and packing her suitcase with meticulous care. She'd even asked me to help her pick out an outfit for her meetings, something she rarely did. At the time, I thought it was sweet, a way for us to connect amidst her busy schedule. But now, looking back, I wonder if it was all just part of the act. The night before she left, we had dinner together, just the two of us. She seemed distant, her mind somewhere else, but I chalked it up to work stress. She'd been under a lot of pressure lately, and I didn't want to add to it. So I let it go, choosing instead to focus on the moment. We talked about our plans for the weekend after she returned, about the vacation we'd been dreaming of taking for years. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. When she left the next morning, I kissed her goodbye and wished her luck. She waved from the car, her smile bright and reassuring. But as I watched her drive away, a strange feeling settled in my chest, a mix of unease and longing that I couldn't quite explain. Over the next 3 days, we stayed in touch, but something felt different. Her texts were short and to the point, lacking the warmth and playfulness I was used to. She'd send pictures of her hotel room, the conference hall, and the city skyline, but they felt impersonal, like she was going through the motions. When we FaceTimed, she seemed distracted, her eyes darting around the room, as if she was afraid someone might walk in. I tried to push my doubts aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. Sarah had never given me a reason not to trust her. She was my best friend, my partner, the person I'd built a life with. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the doubts crept in. When she finally returned home, I was relieved. I'd missed her more than I realized, and I was eager to hear all about her trip. But as soon as she walked through the door, I knew something was off. Her smile was too wide, her laughter too loud. She hugged me tightly, but it felt like she was holding on a little too long, as if she was trying to convince herself, or me, that everything was fine. When I reached for her suitcase, she pulled it away, her laughter ringing in my ears. "I've got it," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. I watched as she dragged it upstairs, her movements hurried and awkward. My heart sank as I realized I didn't recognize the woman standing in front of me. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Sarah was asleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady, but I couldn't relax. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask, fears I didn't want to face. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was letting my imagination run wild, but deep down, I knew the truth. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew, was hiding something. And whatever it was big enough to change everything. The next few days were strange. Sarah was unusually attentive, cooking my favorite meals, and suggesting we watch movies together like we used to. But her phone, which was always within arm's reach, never stopped buzzing. She'd glance at it, her face lighting up, only to quickly lock the screen and shove it into her pocket. I tried to ignore it, but the pit in my stomach grew heavier. It wasn't just the phone. There were other little things I might not have noticed before, but now they stood out like neon signs. The way she'd suddenly start humming to herself, as if lost in a happy memory. The way she'd avoid my gaze when I asked her about her trip, her answers vague and rehearsed. The way she'd linger in the shower longer than usual, as if she needed time alone to think. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the doubts gnawed at me. I found myself replaying every moment of her trip in my head, searching for clues I might have missed. The short texts, the distracted FaceTime calls, the way she'd laughed nervously when I reached for her suitcase, it all added up to something I didn't want to face. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed again. It was face down on the nightstand, and I couldn't help myself. I picked it up. The screen lit up with a notification, "Miss you already. Can't wait for next time." My heart dropped. I didn't open the message I didn't need to. The damage was done. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, my hands trembling. My mind raced with questions I didn't have answers to. Who's texting her? How long had this been going on? And why hadn't I seen it sooner? I felt like a fool, like I'd been living in a bubble while the world moved on without me. When Sarah came out of the shower, she was humming again, a small smile playing on her lips. She didn't seem to notice the tension in the room, the way I was sitting stiffly on the edge of the bed, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. She picked up her phone, glanced at the screen, and her smile faltered for just a second before she locked it and set it aside. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light and casual. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." She kissed me on the forehead and climbed into bed, her back turned to me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I needed to be sure to have more than just a notification to go on. The next day, I found myself watching her more closely, analyzing every word, every gesture. She seemed so normal, so happy, and it made me wonder if I was the one who was broken. Maybe I was imagining things, letting my insecurities get the best of me. But then I'd catch her glancing at her phone, her face lighting up for just a second before she quickly put it away, and the doubts would come rushing back. I started to notice other things too, things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way she'd started wearing more makeup, dressing up even when we were just staying in. The way she'd suddenly become interested in new hobbies, like yoga and painting, things she'd never shown an interest in before. It was as if she was trying to reinvent herself, to become someone else. And then there were the late night texts. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find her side of the bed empty, the soft glow of her phone lighting up the hallway. I'd hear her whispering, her voice low and urgent, but I could never make out what she was saying. By the time I got up to check on her, she'd be back in bed, her phone tucked under her pillow. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, like the ground beneath me was slowly crumbling away. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built a life with, was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the good moments we still had, but the more I tried, the more the doubts consumed me. I found myself questioning everything, our marriage, our future, even my own worth. Was I not enough for her? Had I done something to push her away? The truth was, I didn't know, and that uncertainty was the hardest part. Because without trust, without honesty, what did we have left? I didn't have the answers. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give. I spent the next few days in a daze, replaying every moment of our relationship in my head. Had I missed the signs? Was I not enough for her? The questions gnawed at me, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I watched her closely, searching for more clues. It was like living in a fog, where every interaction felt heavy with unspoken tension. Sarah seemed oblivious, or maybe she was just good at pretending. She continued with her routine cooking, cleaning, laughing at my jokes, but there was a distance between us now, an invisible wall that hadn't been there before. I found myself studying her every move, analyzing her words for hidden meanings, her gestures for signs of guilt. Then, one evening, she left her laptop open on the kitchen table while she went to answer the door. I hesitated for only a moment before opening it. What I found shattered me. Emails, photos, receipts, all evidence of an affair that had been going on for months. The business trips, the late nights at the office, the sudden interest in self-care weekends, it all made sense now. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the emails, each one more damning than the last. There were messages filled with longing, with promises of future meetings, with details of their time together, photos of them smiling, laughing, holding hands, receipts from hotels, restaurants, even a jewelry store. It was like a punch to the gut, each piece of evidence knocking the air out of me. I felt sick, my stomach churning, as the reality of what I was seeing sank in. This wasn't a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a full-blown affair, something she had been carefully hiding from me for who knows how long. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built a life with, was a stranger. When I heard her footsteps approaching, I quickly closed the laptop and stepped away, my heart pounding in my chest. She walked in, smiling, completely unaware of what I had just discovered. "Who was at the door?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Just a neighbor," she said, setting a package on the counter. "They needed a signature for a delivery." I nodded, forcing a smile. "That's nice." She glanced at the laptop, her smile faltering for just a second before she picked it up and tucked it under her arm. "I'm going to finish up some work in the study," she said, her voice light and casual. "Okay," I said, watching as she walked away. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the laptop had been, my mind racing. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about Sarah, was a lie, and I didn't know how to process that. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions going to work, coming home, eating dinner, but I felt like a ghost, disconnected from everything around me. Sarah seemed to sense something was wrong, but she didn't push. Instead, she became even more attentive, more affectionate, as if trying to make up for something. But it was too late. The trust we had was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that I didn't know how to fill. Every time I looked at her, I saw the lies. Every time she smiled, I wondered if it was genuine or just another act. I found myself replaying the moments I had discovered over and over in my head, each time feeling the same crushing weight of betrayal. The emails, the photos, the receipts, they were like a movie on repeat, each scene more painful than the last. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I needed time to process, to figure out what I wanted to do next. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no easy answer. The truth was, I still loved her. Despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal, I couldn't just turn off my feelings. But I also knew I couldn't keep living like this, in a marriage built on secrets and deceit. I felt trapped, caught between the life I had and the life I wanted. I didn't know how to move forward, how to rebuild what had been broken. All I knew was that something had to change, and it had to change soon. I couldn't keep it in any longer. That night after dinner, I sat her down and told her what I knew. At first, she denied it, her face a mask of shock and indignation. But when I showed her the evidence, her expression crumbled. She broke down in tears, begging for forgiveness, saying it was a mistake, that she never meant to hurt me. The room felt heavy, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 1,000 times, but now that it was here, I felt completely unprepared. My hands shook as I handed her the printed emails, the photos, the receipts. She stared at them, her face pale, her hands trembling. "I can explain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then explain," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She took a deep breath, her eyes filled with tears. "It started a few months ago," she began, her voice shaky. "He was a colleague, someone I worked closely with. It was just supposed to be a friendship, but then..." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I felt a lump in my throat, my chest tightening with every word she spoke. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to happen. I never meant to hurt you." I wanted to believe her, to believe that it was just a mistake, a moment of weakness. But the evidence in front of me told a different story. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a full-blown affair, something she had been carefully hiding from me for months. How long, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her eyes filled with guilt. 6 months, she said finally. 6 months. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. 6 months of lies, of deceit, of betrayal. I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling, like everything I thought I knew about my marriage was a lie. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. Why did you do it? She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. I was lonely, I guess. You were always so busy with work, and I felt like we were drifting apart. He made me feel wanted, needed. It was stupid, I know, but I didn't know how to stop it. I felt a lump in my throat, my chest tightening with every word she spoke. I wanted to be angry, to scream, to yell, but all I felt was a deep, aching sadness. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built a life with, was a stranger. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never meant to hurt you. I love you. I really do. I messed up. I looked at her, my heart breaking with every word she spoke. I wanted to believe her, to believe that she was truly sorry, that she still loved me. But the trust we had was gone, shattered into a million pieces. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, my voice trembling. She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. I understand, she said, her voice breaking. I hope you can give me a chance to make it right. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, love. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of her betrayal hanging heavy in the air. I didn't know how to move forward, how to rebuild what had been broken. All I knew was that something had to change. Finally, I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I need some time, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. I understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I walked out of the room, my mind racing. I didn't know what the future held, if we could ever rebuild what had been broken. But I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give, and it had to give soon. In the weeks that followed, we tried to work through it. Counseling, late-night conversations, promises to do better, but the betrayal was like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Every time I looked at her, I saw the lies. Every time she smiled, I wondered if it was genuine or just another act. The counseling sessions were grueling, each one dredging up emotions I didn't know I had. We sat in that small, sterile room, the therapist's calm voice guiding us through the wreckage of our marriage. Sarah was open, vulnerable even, admitting her mistakes and expressing her regret. But no matter how much she apologized, no matter how many tears she shed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. I wanted to believe her, to believe that we could move past this. But the trust we had built over 7 years was gone, shattered in an instant. I found myself questioning everything: her words, her actions, even her intentions. Was she really sorry, or was she just trying to salvage what was left of our life together? The late-night conversations were the hardest. We'd lie in bed, the darkness wrapping around us like a heavy blanket, and talk about everything and nothing. She'd tell me how much she loved me, how much she wanted to make things right. I'd listen, my heart aching with a mix of love and pain, but the words felt hollow. I tried to focus on the good moments, the ones that reminded me why I fell in love with her in the first place. The way she laughed at my stupid jokes, the way she'd surprise me with my favorite meal after a long day, the way she'd hold my hand when we watched movies together. But even those moments were tainted now, overshadowed by the betrayal that had come between us. I found myself withdrawing, pulling away from her in ways I didn't even realize. I'd come home from work and retreat to the study, burying myself in books or mindless television shows just to avoid the awkward silence that had settled between us. She'd try to reach out, to bridge the gap, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her halfway. The truth was, I didn't know how to move forward. I didn't know if I could ever trust her again, if I could ever look at her without seeing the lies. The thought of starting over, of rebuilding what had been broken, felt overwhelming. One night, as we sat on the couch, the television flickering in the background, she turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to fix this," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to make it right." I looked at her, my heart aching with a mix of love and pain. "I don't know either," I said, my voice trembling. We sat there in silence, the weight of her betrayal hanging heavy in the air. I wanted to believe that we could move past this, that we could rebuild what had been broken. But the truth was, I didn't know if I had the strength to do it. Eventually, I realized I couldn't stay. The love we once had was tainted, and no amount of effort could erase what had happened. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most necessary. The day I moved out, she stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart breaking with every word she spoke. "I know," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I walked out of the house, my bags in hand, and didn't look back. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I knew it was the right thing. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life, on finding myself again. It wasn't easy. There were days when the pain felt unbearable, when the memories of what we had would come rushing back, threatening to drown me. But I kept going, one step at a time. I started seeing a therapist, someone who could help me navigate the complex emotions I was feeling. I reconnected with old friends, people who had been there for me before Sarah, before the betrayal. I even picked up new hobbies, things I had always wanted to try but never had the time for. It was a slow process, but with each passing day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. The pain didn't go away, it never really does, but it became more manageable, something I could live with. Sarah reached out a few times, her messages filled with apologies and regrets. I read them, my heart aching with a mix of love and pain, but I never responded. I knew that for me to truly move forward, I needed to let go of the past, of the life we had together. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most necessary. Because sometimes losing something is the only way to find yourself again. And that's exactly what I intend to do.